Hey everyone, welcome back to another tutorial here. We're going to be getting into knitting this time. This is kind of building off of the braiding and rope and twisting and stuff like that, all of those other tutorials I did last year. We're going to be kind of building off of that, and then I'm hoping to do kind of a modular series of tutorials coming up covering different techniques with knitting, and hopefully you'll have some building blocks and techniques that you can kind of mix and match to build your own tools and looks and animations and stuff like that. In this one, we're just going to take a look at basically building a start kind of knitting textile and how you can color it, and then using your own kind of shaping tools, almost like you're grooming a hair or fur kind of generation. This is similar techniques with building out a bunch of fibers that are actually going to represent these knitted curves. And all of this stuff here is super procedural, so you're able to control a lot of this look. You can set the different spacing here for this knit pattern, and you can kind of keep all of the different sliders and parameters and stuff like that balanced. So it's a pretty flexible, and this is what I mean by modular, is you can kind of go in and replace things. You can go in and tweak things. You can change the look and feel and stuff like that pretty quickly by just playing around with a bunch of the different parameters and options and stuff like that. And then we'll just wrap up by doing a quick Vellum simulation. I just did a very simple grid, added some initial force or velocity, and we'll look at how you can kind of parent your textile or your fabric to that simulation, kind of on top of everything, and then finally rendering and lighting using Redshift, just using the hair shader that comes with Redshift. I think using a GPU renderer to do these indirect bounces in like high quantity of surfaces, it's definitely a lot faster to use a GPU renderer than I tried it in the past with Mantra, and it was super slow. Possibly in the future, we'll go into some other renderers using a same curves or same data set, and we'll see how it fares with other renderers. But for right now, this tutorial, we're just going to end rendering and lighting using Redshift. I'm still kind of addicted to their photographic exposure and a lot of those controls and stuff like that they have built in that lets you get a lot of the look in the camera without doing a ton of post-production and stuff like that. So I hope you guys are excited. This is definitely a fun one and pretty important if you're getting into future knitting techniques and stuff like that. This is kind of a foundational piece, just knowing how to build out these patterns. There's a lot of flexibility and options and stuff like that you can move into later on, just knowing these kind of basic techniques. All right, so I've prepared a few nodes here just to get us started. Basically, this curve node, we're drawing half of a knit shape, like this S curve, like a little squiggle. And then the reason to just start with half is you can kind of procedurally work with it a little bit easier and just mirror it over, and then you're basically saving half of the work. You don't have to keep replicating it on both sides. This rotate is a nice little control if you want to flip or kind of angle the knit a little bit. And then this carve right here is a pretty useful node that just lets you trim the ends. So it's another kind of procedural way of controlling the overall length of this base shape. And then if we use the match size node, this is a super useful kind of utility node. I'm just going to disable Y, we'll disable Z, and if we set X to max, we can basically justify this to the X axis. So if we turn on the grid, we're basically on the negative side of X. We maybe just go into the top view if you want to be super precise or exact. And then if we mirror, we'll just reflect this over the X axis. So if we take a look here with this, you can see now we are able to procedurally manipulate that, and it will always be aligned. If we don't do this step, you can see we're going to have a gap or something like that. So we'll do this. And the mirror node also will snap the seam, this meeting point right here. It does have some issues though, like it still thinks that these are two separate curves. If I turn on primitive numbers, you can see we have 0 and 1. So if you do want to fix that, you can just use the polypath node. And this will consolidate everything into a single continuous curve or just a single primitive. And the last thing we'll do now is just another match size. And we're going to use this one a little bit differently. We go back into the 3D view. And I'm going to switch this into scale to fit. And I'm going to disable uniform scale. So that will allow us to independently adjust the height. This is the z-axis, or kind of the length. And the width, I'm going to leave this here at 1. For this, the width I'm just calling is the x-axis or across. So if we leave this at a unit or 1, we always know that if we're going to copy it over, we could shift it by 1 unit and we'll be touching, or will be a perfect distance to keep shifting it. So we'll do that. And then we have this single row kind of built out. And if we want to do another copy and transform, this will allow us to go in the z direction. And if we just switch this to 0.5, then you can see we have kind of interlocking curves. And maybe we'll go to 45. And again, you can see we have individual primitives here. If we use the polypath node again, and this time we want to do connect endpoints, then it will join these to a single continuous curve. So it kind of fuses the endpoints together like that. And you could also do subdivide. So this will provide more interpolation or smooth interpolation between the points and just give you a better fidelity or like a higher resolution of the curve. And then we could just do a sweep to give these thickness. Just go into round tube and turn that off for now. And now you can visualize the pattern, and hopefully you get a sense this kind of power of working with a single template shape like this. You can make little tweaks like that. If you want to do the jitter, you can even kind of procedurally maybe just get some different random outcomes. Some of this might be a little too much, but basically you can just come up with your own shapes or your own little tweaks on it. If you're more into modeling, you can go back here to the base curve and you could make adjustments here and kind of visualize the result on the final propagated pattern and everything like that. So I'm just going to maybe disable that. You can move that down, move that over here. And this is basically a very rudimentary approach, but just wanted to show you the most basic or straightforward method first, and then we can move forward with an even more robust kind of modular method after this. So let's just save this here as knitting 02. So moving forward, basically we don't want to have to keep fiddling with these numbers over here to create fabrics and stuff like that. It's a lot of balancing of different numbers. If you're changing the size of things and all that, it's not a very flexible way to work. So what I'm going to do is basically keep this input curve, this base shape that's a unit size here, and I'm going to make a grid, and then we're going to basically use the grid as this input area that's going to get filled with these curves. And then we're going to make it so it will be flexible. We can adjust the resolution of the curves, or like the repetitions, using a single slider, and basically everything will adapt to what we select. So basically, grid is the input. This is the area we want to fill, and then we'll have a single slider that will just give us like the density that we want to pack with this knitting shape, or the knitting pattern. So if we do points from volume, this is a really nice node. Typically use it with like 3D space or volumes, but even with 2D surfaces, it's really useful. You have the grid, a tetrahedral configuration. So just laying out points like this and then being able to select the separation is a pretty handy way to generate these patterns. And then the other thing that's super nice is you can make this particle radius scale. And that basically just records the point separation. If I do copy to points here, and we'll just put a box here. This basically will ensure that these are touching, or these are packed in perfectly. So I'm just giving it a little bit of space here so you can see that each one is perfectly packed. And because we've put everything here to a unit width or a unit size, we should be able to connect this input and get a similar result. But you can see we're missing a little bit of a row because we did a shift by 0.5 units to get these to overlap or interlock like this. So if we want to do the same thing over here with this method, I'm just going to add another copy and transform. And this one, we can just do -0.5. So we're basically doing that shift, and then we'll have the proper amount, or we'll have the interlocking curves. And we can do polypath here to join the curves so that it's a continuous strand or a continuous piece of yarn. And we can do the subdivide as well. And then you can see we're getting the smooth resolution, and we can do the sweep. And I'm going to set this again to round tube. I'm going to get rid of the stretch around turns. And with this, if we go back to a higher separation, you can see that this radius or the thickness of the tubes isn't adapting to the spacing. It's remaining kind of constant. The reason that this happens is because this copy to points node doesn't keep track or doesn't pass through the pscale. It uses the pscale to determine the uniform scale of this template object that you're going to drop onto the points. But after that, it thinks that you don't want it, or it like discards it. In most cases, you usually don't want it, but in this case, we want to keep it. So I'm just going to get rid of that exclusion character, the caret. It's like an up arrow. And you can see now we still retain the pscale. And that's useful because the sweep node can then use it as well. So if we play around with this spacing, you can see now it is keeping track of it. So we're able to very easily now just control the pattern spacing, this kind of knitting density, using a single slider. And the radius, or that will adapt, the spacing will adapt, all of that will adapt. And if we want the width to adjust as well, we're able to very easily go in and play around with that. So we have a pretty useful kind of knitting setup now. Just get rid of that. We're able to just use this input grid or surface area that we want to fill with knitting. We can set the knit spacing. And then if you do want to do little tweaks or stuff like that on top of it to adjust this, you can freely add little edits like that. But it's just a multiplier that sits on top of the input settings. So you don't have to go in and constantly tweak these values for different spacing or different settings and stuff like that, which is super handy. Okay, so now that we have these tubes, this is kind of just a visualization of like the amount of space, the thickness of the yarn or whatever you're knitting here. We're gonna actually fill this with individual curves or like fibers or hairs. So we'll do another sweep, and I'm just gonna plug that in right here and go to round tube again. So this is set to quadrilaterals like we did over here. And if we just want specific portions of the quadrilateral, you can get either the columns or the rows. So if we look at the rows, we'll just get those circles. And if we look at the columns, we'll actually get individual curves that are running like along the surface or the thickness of the tube. So this is pretty useful. You can also do some rolling or twisting. If we just set this to per edge, we'll basically scale this twist by the edge length. So if we do a resample and change the resolution, you can also change the amount of twisting there. So it's pretty nice, but it still kind of looks too clean. Like all of these are just going along the surface of the tube. They're all evenly spaced out. So if we want to make that a little bit more random, what I'm going to do is use this rest position node. And right up here before the sweep, we're basically just going to make a copy of the point position and put that into the rest attribute. And then after we do the sweep, we'll still have that rest attribute. And I'm actually going to switch this over here. And we also want to keep the pscale again in this case. So I'm just going to delete that caret or the exclusion character. So we'll keep that. And we can just call this columns like that. And then if we use a VOP node, we can use this to mix some of the rest position back into the point position. And that will allow us to just add some more randomness or natural look to the knit or to the yarns. So just say mix rest with P. And we can use the bind node. I'm going to switch this to a vector, 3-float vector. So we have rest, 3 floats, X, Y, Z. And you put it like that. Spell it correctly. And if I plug it in, you can see everything snaps to the middle. And if we use the mix node, we can basically use this to blend the amount. So 0 to 1 blends between these two inputs. And if you're more familiar with Vex or using Wrangle snippets, you can right-click here, go to Type Properties, and you can see here this is using the lerp function. So if you want to recreate this using Vex or in a Wrangle node, you can get an idea of what functions some of these VOPs are running like that. And then this bias right here, if we want to drive that using a random function, we can take this, put it into the primitive number. If we visualize it with color, basically this is going to generate a random 0 to 1 number per curve. So I can plug that into the bias like that. And now we're basically getting, each curve is going to randomly go from the center to the outside position. So we're not getting that evenly spaced effect anymore, and we're getting some nice natural randomness or spacing. You can also use this fit function, fit range. And this is 0 is the original position. So if we remap this, you can kind of control the range. So if you want, basically you don't want these curves to go too close to the center, because then they're going to be like too stacked up. So I usually maybe go to like 0.6 or something like that. And then some of them will go towards the center, but they'll never get too far in that they're basically invisible or too hidden in the middle of those curves. You might also want to use this power function. You can use this to basically adjust the distribution. And I'm just going to put it up here. So if we increase this exponent, you're basically going to get the majority of them out on the surface. If you go down to fractional numbers, you'll get the tendency for most of them to be not on the surface and somewhat blended in towards the middle. So this is a nice way with a slider. You can kind of add an additional probability, or basically increase the chance that these will be closer to the surface. And then the next thing I'm going to do is use another attribute VOP, and we're going to take this and we're going to add curl noise to P. I'm going to switch this to analytic simplex. I'm going to use this vector to a vector 4. And I'm just going to plug it up like this. And by default, some of this stuff is way too crazy. What I'm going to do is actually use this pscale attribute that we were preserving to control the noise, some qualities or characteristics of the noise. So if we import the pscale attribute, I'm going to multiply the curl noise amplitude, or the amount of it, by the pscale. So basically, as we change the thickness of these curves or the spacing, you actually also control the distance or amplitude of the noise along with it. And I'm also going to reduce the amplitude there. Another thing I'm going to do for this frequency of the noise, or the noise input coordinate, I'm going to divide the position by this pscale amount. So this as well will link the pscale to the kind of frequency of the noise. So as we adjust the spacing of the input points, or those, basically everything should be linked up, and we don't need to always go in and balance these parameters as much. If you want to additionally control the frequency of the noise, you can use multiply constant. And if we want a higher frequency, you can just multiply by 2. You can see there it's getting a little crazy. But sometimes it's nice to have that fuzziness. I'm just going to do a little bit less. So this is looking pretty cool. The only thing is that it's a little weird that all of these are getting pushed in the same direction. We want it more like randomness or a little bit more chaotic. So again, we can use this random function, and it's per primitive or per curve again. We're going to generate a random number, and we're going to use that fourth component of the input to the curl noise. So this will allow us, if we again multiply constant, we can control how much independent randomness you want from the basically nearby curves. So instead of just using the point position, the 3D coordinates where it has this basically tendency to give the same direction for nearby points, this allows you to break up that basically per curve. And we could probably go even lower there. Maybe something like that. Another thing you might want to do is you could take another fit function and basically using this random number again, you could additionally multiply it. So you have some more control here. You can use that power function again, like that. So if we want not very probable amount of randomness or noise added to the curves, you can do it like that. Or if you want the majority of them to receive the curl noise, you can do that. So this is another way to basically add that probabilistic noise per curve. So do that. And I'm going to increase the minimum. So we're always giving at least a little bit of curl noise to the curves. So you can see there how much it's breaking everything up. And the last thing I'm going to do is another attribute VOP. And this one we're going to calculate the normal direction. So depending on how you render these curves, it can be nice to know a direction that this surface should be oriented. For specular highlights or stuff like that, it can make a big difference. What I'm going to do to get that direction, I'm going to use the bind node again. We're going to set it to 3-float vector. We're going to get the rest position. So that's basically the direction that the position that it came from, which is the center of these curves. So if we subtract that from the current position and put that into the n normal direction, we can enable normals. And now we're getting basically a direction that's pointing back to the center of the curves. And typically people will normalize this just to make sure it's a unit length. If your visualization there is a little too crazy, you can just press the D key under guides. You could scale the normal down to be a little bit less. And let me actually go smaller. So if I increase the total amount of columns or curves, we go maybe up to 32, you should start to get more of a cohesive direction that all of these would be pointing, that can give you a nice specular breakup. If we do another orient along curve, I'm just going to use this to make this tangent the up vector. And then if we do another sweep node down here, let's set this to ribbon. And I think by default it's a little bit too many cross sections. So let's just get rid of these columns. You can just remove it, set it down to 1. And the width here, we can go a little bit lower. So this should give you a little bit better idea of what I was hoping to get. We can turn off the back-facing polygons. So if we don't have this information, basically this is the up vector from tangent. So if I get rid of these normal and up, we just have less information to go off of. You can see independently these are getting just random directions or random orientations that these ribbons are facing. Once we put them back in, then we get a more cohesive direction. And again, as you increase the total, not that much, as you increase the total number of fibers or strands filling this, it definitely makes a difference. You can even see in the viewport, you're getting a more cohesive or proper lighting response along the direction, and it looks more like a cohesive bundle of yarn that isn't as kind of wild or broken up or anything like that. And I'm just going to do a couple more tweaks here. I think the base radius, we can make that a little bit wider. And then this curl noise, I think the amplitude here, we can let it get a little bit crazier. Let's just go to 0.1. And then the twist down here, I'm just going to add a little bit more spinning of this yarn. And lastly, if we zoom out, you can get a good general feeling of the texture without even doing a render, just visualizing it with these ribbons. And if we start to play around with this point separation, we could go higher. You should see the general properties or characteristics of everything remains relatively the same. Obviously, it's not going to be kind of one-to-one as you zoom in and out, but because we've preserved the pscale attribute throughout all of these and have derived or produced our noise result based off of it, we basically get a much more consistent look and feel to these yarns. And if you don't do that, you would have to go in and do a lot more balancing, updating of this radius, updating of the noise frequencies and stuff like that, updating of this ribbon thickness. So that's why it's really nice to preserve the pscale attribute and to include it as like a scale function to all of your later nodes, basically to allow this to support more scales, more inputs without having to do as much tweaking and adjustments and stuff like that. It's nice to not have to worry about messing with all those all the time. So we basically have two results now. We can either do tubes, that's kind of a quick approximate visualization from a distance. It looks good, but it's not a crazy high data set. And then these are going to be more of the curves that you could render for high resolution close-ups and stuff like that. It is a much higher data set. We're not going to render these as actual ribbons, but just for visualization and stuff like that. It's a good, quick way to kind of update things. Okay, now that we have this area of fabric or textile generated, I'm just going to do a quick Vellum simulation to kind of make a drape or some nice folds and wrinkles and stuff like that. So if we do a grid right here, this could be like our base cloth. And you go up to a little higher resolution. So you just want to have enough grid points to capture kind of the frequency and shape and stuff like that of folds that you're going to want to generate. And we can do the Vellum configure cloth. I'm just going to do a little bit more tangent drag, and then we can do the Vellum solver. This last one doesn't matter too much. It's the collisions, but right now it's empty. And we're just going to actually do this ground plane on the solver for collisions. And we could also increase the wind drag on the solver. And also maybe increase the constraint iterations as well. Should just give you a little bit more accurate solve. And right now nothing happens. We're basically just starting with it on the ground. I'm going to insert a transform node here just to lift it off of the ground plane. So just set it up by 5 units. And you can see right now it's just a pretty boring result or simulation. There's no noise or randomness or any interesting details being added. So everything's just perfectly symmetrical and even and flat. But we could just use the attribute noise vector, and you can see this is already set up to affect the velocity. And if we visualize it right here, you can turn on velocity vector. So we can crank that up a little bit. And this is going to be basically the initial force that we're going to push the cloth into the simulation with. And we could try something, just go up to 35, something like that. And then the simulation will inherit that, or it will basically start with that vector. And then when it falls down, it will basically have some interesting areas where it could catch some of the air or the wind. And when it finally falls down, it should get basically a more interesting position or shape in general. So you just have some nice areas and stuff like that to catch the light or give yourself some shadows and everything. So now that we have this generated, one thing you might want to do is put down this point deform. So I'm going to just bring these down here. We actually don't want to use the final ribbons because that's like another way to kind of visualize everything. We can just go up here where we have the normal direction. And I'm going to clean up some of these attributes here so we can get rid of the rest. And right now we can take the pscale and we can rename it to width. And then if we go up one level, I'm going to turn on shade open curves in the viewport. And that could be maybe a little bit too thick. But basically, if you rename this from pscale to width, the viewport, once you tick on that shade open curves, the viewport will draw things with that thickness. So I think we can do multiply and could multiply it down quite a bit, maybe like 0.035 or something like that. So this is another approximation of the curve thickness, it just does it in the viewport. It's not actual building out the actual geometry like this one was. So it's a little bit faster to draw and faster to work with. And then we can put this in. This is the geometry that we want to basically deform. And then the rest point lattice is the geometry you want to capture with. So we're actually going to go all the way up to this base grid up here. And it will basically look at this input geometry, find out its relative position or distance to this capture geometry, and then we can use the final output of the simulation as kind of a deform geometry. And then it will basically bind or deform from the starting position to this final position to mimic or to basically assume the draped position of the cloth. And this radius, I think it's a little bit too big usually by default. If it does get to be like too big, it can kind of slow things down, or it can give you a little bit maybe too smooth of a result. And you could also reduce maybe the maximum points to also make sure that things are still running pretty quick. So I think those settings are pretty good. Another thing you can do to give it a little bit better of a result is if you just add a subdivide node here, and you actually want to copy it. I'm just holding Alt, clicking and dragging to make sure that these are the same resolution. Basically, the topology of these two inputs, the point count and everything like that, needs to match for the results to be accurate. So now we're getting a better, more smooth capture and everything like that. And you just give this some more space like that. And then the interesting thing or the cool thing is that you can still kind of go up here and do some kind of look dev, or you can start to change these settings on the input. So it's a really cool way that you can work kind of backwards in time. It's the procedural nature of Houdini is that you can still tweak a lot of kind of qualities of the textile itself without having to re-simulate things, because we're just basically binding the fabric to the cloth simulation. And then because we have this pscale attribute, like determining a lot of the factors down here, we don't have to keep going in and managing a lot of these settings. We can get a consistent look across different fabric kind of thread counts and stuff like that. One thing you might have to do is if you do start to push this, you realize we're losing some resolution. So this resample down here, I'm just going to increase the, decrease the edge length, or basically the segment length. We might be getting a little bit too high on the overall thread count, just geometry. So you usually go a lot lower with these number of threads here overall. And when you're doing that, you can boost the width, the thickness here, and you'll still get a pretty good result overall. So this is a quick kind of interactive way to generate procedural textiles. You get really interesting controls and capabilities where you're able to tweak everything basically in different orders, and you're not really bound to a single look, and you can still iterate or still work on things later on. So this is definitely one of the most powerful or flexible approaches I've found so far to working with cloths and textiles and stuff like that.